everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Chad, and this is the first video in a series on JavaScript array methods you need to know as a software engineer. In this video, we're going to talk about forEach, map, filter, and reduce. We'll go over some examples and also show how to perform the same operations with regular loops to compare the solutions. And without further ado, let's get into it. The first one we'll look at is forEach, and this is probably the simplest one in the video. So forEach iterates over the array and applies the provided function to each item. And a helpful way to remember the functionality is to say for each item, I want to do blank, where blank is the logic in the provided function. So let's take a look at that. So we can say characters and forEach, and this accepts a function, and this is what will contain the logic that we want to do for each item. And this function, my caps lock here. So this function will accept each item as it iterates through the array. Now, for now, we'll just maybe log out the character's first name. So if we save that, then we can see here SpongeBob, Tommy, Angelica, Reggie, Mickey, and Minnie. Cool. You also get the index as the second argument. So we can maybe modify this to say, oops, the character is at index. Okay, so we'll save that. And we'll see that SpongeBob is at index 0, Angelica is at 2, and so on and so forth. Now, less commonly known is that you actually get the array itself as the third argument as well. So let's see here. So we'll just console log this out as well. Okay, so that's cool, but I rarely, if ever, use that functionality. I have yet to find a use case for that. If you have found one, then definitely let me know down below in the comments. I'd love to hear that. But I just wanted to give you that tip, as that is something that is available. So as I mentioned in the start of the video, each one of these methods can be written as a loop instead, whether that's with for or while loops. So I suspect most folks will already be able to translate forEach into a regular for loop, since this is, there's not a whole lot going on here, but we'll do that anyway, just for the sake of completeness. If you're not interested in that, feel free to skip ahead a few seconds to the next array method. So we'll just do our traditional for loop, and we'll iterate up to characters.length. Make sure to increment I every time, and we'll console log each character's first name. So we'll just comment this out so we don't get too many logs. Okay, and you can see that we still get each character's first name logged out. So it's not terribly different than the initial forEach, but you still have to worry about a temp variable I, and as well as getting the conditional statement correct and incrementing your counter each time. It's not really a big deal at the end of the day, but personally I still think forEach is cleaner and easier to read. Next up is the map function, and I use this one a ton, and this one maps the target array into a new array, allowing you to add, remove, or modify aspects of each item. So let's get rid of this here. Now let's say we have this array of characters and we only want the first names from this array. Using the map function, we can, let's give a const there, and we can iterate over each of these. And again, this map function accepts a function as an argument, similar to forEach. And in this case, as we iterate over, we'll just return the character dot first name, and we'll see what that looks like. So you'll notice here that instead of printing out each of the names individually, this time we're actually getting an array of the names themselves, right? So we went from an array of objects, each of which contained a first name, a last name, and an age, and we're mapping that array to a different one that only contains the first names. And similar to forEach, the second and third arguments to the function provided to map are the item index and the array itself. I won't show those as an example because the functionality is exactly the same here. So again, for completeness, I'll go over real quick how to do this same functionality using a loop. So let's come down here and we'll say const first names. We'll set that equal to an empty array, and using the trusty for loop, we'll iterate up to the length of characters and make sure to increment I. And on every iteration, we will push that current iteration's character's first name onto the first names array. It's kind of a mouthful, and we're also using an array method that I won't be talking about in this video, but be sure to subscribe to the channel because I will be making a video that I'll talk about push in, and that will be coming out soon. And let's lock that out. We'll just get rid of that here. And you can see here, once we save and reload that, we're winding up with the exact same array as with map. I don't know about you, but I definitely prefer map. It's way cleaner in my opinion, but to each their own. Alright, so next step is the filter function. And I use this one a ton as well, as it's a really clean way to condense an array to just the items I care about for a given use case. Let's take a look. I'll get rid of this here. And let's say we want to get an array of characters who are younger than 50. Alright, so we've got our characters array, and we'll call the filter function on it. Now, this function also accepts a function similar to forEach and map. And the first argument that that function receives will be each item of the iteration. So in this case, it'll be a character, and we want to return a Boolean in this case, and we want to return true if we want that value to be included in the resulting array. So I want to say that I want the character if their age is less than 50. So let's go ahead and console log that out. And if we open this result up over here, we can see we've got SpongeBob, Tommy, Angelica, and Reggie, all of whom are younger than 50. Great. So even though I use filter all the time, it did take me a little while to get down what I should return in the provided function. Should I return true if I want the value, or false to filter it out, or vice versa? Well, it's helped me nail down this functionality to think about it in plain English. So in this example, I might say, I want to filter the characters to those less than 50, so I need to return whether or not the age is less than 50. And that's exactly what we've done here. As a quick note, filter also receives the index in the array itself, just like forEach and map. Again, I rarely use the array argument in this case, but index can be a little bit more useful, I suppose. So let's say we take the index here, and we'll return index less than 2. And what we get over here is SpongeBob and Tommy. So you can see SpongeBob's index is 0, Tommy's index is 1. So effectively, we're actually filtering this array to a number of items. And while filter can be used to do this, it's not necessarily the most intuitive to understand. And the slice method is actually a bit cleaner, and we'll talk about slice in an upcoming video in the series. So again, if you're interested in that, definitely be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to be notified when that video is published. All right, so moving on, to wrap up filter, let's go over what it might look like as a for loop. So we'll just get a clean slate going here, comment that out. And we'll start with an empty array, and we will set up our filter function. Now remember, we want this filter function to accept a character and to return whether or not this character's age is less than 50. So we'll say character.age less than 50, looking very similar to our previous examples so far. But now let's bring in the loop. And in this case, let's grab that iteration's character. Now for every iteration, we want to apply the filter function and only include that iteration's character if the result from that filter function is true. So we can say if filter function, pass in that character, and I guess technically for completeness we should also pass in I and characters, even though our filter function isn't using it. But in any case, if that filter function returns true, then we will push that character onto the resultant array. And let's come down here and log that result. And you can see here that we now have the exact same array that we started with our first filter example, 4 characters, all of whom are younger than 50. Now, I don't know about you, but this is kind of gross. We went from maybe 3 lines to more than 8. Now, it's not to say that less code always means it's better or easier to understand, but in my opinion, it does mean it's easier to understand in the case of filter. Filter to me is way easier to read than something like this. All right, folks, the big kahuna, as it were, reduce. Reduce is, in my opinion, one of the least intuitive array methods in JavaScript, but it is extremely useful and definitely worth knowing in my opinion. The basic idea is I want to reduce an array to a single value. Now the single value part is pretty loose in JavaScript, but let's go through a somewhat common example first. I'll get rid of this here, and we won't use the characters for the moment, but we'll leave them there. We're going to hang out. So let's say I have an array representing the items in my shopping cart on an e-commerce site. And finally, I've got some socks. Lots of socks, actually, because you can never have too many socks. So I've got my cart items. Now I want to display a cart icon that the user can click on to view their cart. And I want to add a badge to the cart icon with a number of items in their cart. I'm not going to actually do that visually in this example, but you can imagine. In this case, reduce is the perfect way to handle this. So let's say I want to find out num items in cart, because that's exactly the value we're looking for here. So we'll say cart items reduce, and I'm just going to write this out, and then we'll look at it and talk about it at the end here. Oops. Okay. Now, if we console this out, cart, we should see that we have 8 items in our cart. Perfect. So there's 2 t-shirts, 1 hoodie, and 5 socks. Excellent. So that's working. Maybe this looks intimidating to you. Maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure, but let's break it down a bit more to talk about the individual pieces. So the reduce function takes 2 arguments. The first argument is the reducer function itself, and the second argument is the initial value. So this reducer function, everything here, takes the previous state, or the accumulator, we say, and the current value. And in this example would be total items and item, respectively. And this reducer function mashes these values together in some way to return the next value for the next iteration. And in this case, we add the previous total number of items in the cart to the current item's quantity and return that value. So this is the previous number of items, meaning from the prior iteration, and we add the current iteration item's quantity. Now this returned value will wind up being the total items in the next iteration. That's a lot to talk through, so let's add some logging to see if we can understand this a little bit better. So let's see, I want to say and as another side note here, the reducer function does also accept the index and the array itself, similar to forEach and map. I'll use the index here, but I'll leave the array off. Okay, so we want to look at total items. We want to look at the current items quantity. And we want to look at the next total items. Perfect. And we'll just log out a little delimiter here to make things a little bit easier to see. Sweet. Okay, so let's save this here. All right, so looking at this output, we can see that for each iteration, we get the iteration number. That makes sense. So 0, 1, and 2. Perfect, because there's 3 items. And then we see total items. So the first time through, this total items value actually winds up being equal to initial value, this second argument that's passed to reduce. So you can see that here. So we start out with total items being 0. And on the first iteration, the current item's quantity is 2. That item is the t-shirt. So adding those two together, 0 and 2, we get the next total items value. On iteration number 1, in other words, the second iteration, now total items is set to 2, because this value that we returned from the first iteration is carried over into the second one. And for this iteration, the current item quantity is 1, so we're looking at the hoodie now, and adding those two together, total items and the current item quantity, we get 3. And you can see that this 3 value is passed to the next total items. And in the last iteration, we have total items set to 3, and the current item quantity is 5, because we're looking at the socks. Adding those two together, the next total items, which happens to be the final result, is 8. So that covers using reduce to get the sum of the values in an array. But what else can we do with it? Well, remember how we said the reduce method wants to reduce an array of items to a single value, and that single value concept is pretty loose in JavaScript? Well, here's what I mean. Let's go back to our characters example And let's say we want to group all characters that have the same age together into an array. Reduce can help us here too. I'll just comment this out for the moment. Now let's say we want to call this characters by age, and we'll call reduce again on this array of characters. Now in this case, we're going to pass an empty object as the initial value. And we'll call this accumulator chars by age. I don't know, naming's hard. And we receive this character value. This is what we get on each iteration. Okay, so let's pull the age off of each character. And we check if chars by age sub age doesn't exist. So in other words, if chars by age doesn't have the property age on it, then we'll add one, and we'll make that an empty array. And into that array we've just added, we will push the current character, and we'll return chars by age. And we'll see what that looks like. Awesome. Okay, so notice here that we've reduced the array into a single object, which still counts for the single value goal. We were able to do that by passing an empty object as the initial value, and that's happening right here, and returning the accumulator, in other words, this first argument to the reducer function, returning that accumulator inside the reducer function after modifying its properties. So we're modifying its properties here and returning the same outer reference. So that's cool. And just to be sure here, we've got Tommy age 31 and both Mickey and Minnie age 33. Excellent. Now what if we want the characters grouped by last name? Well, easy. We just change the property we use. So if I just change age to last name, save that, now we can see that we've got two characters with the last name Mouse, two with the last name Pickles, one for Rocket, one for SquarePants. Now, in this case, characters by age variable doesn't correctly describe the result anymore, and you could probably clean this up a little bit, but I hope you get the idea. All right, so one final bonus tip. Reduce can actually help you chain promises together. Now this one's really cool. Let's check it out. All right, using our characters example again, I will comment this out. Now let's make a function here. We'll call it do network request. We'll have that accept a name. And this function is going to return a promise, and we're simulating a network request here. So to simulate that, we'll just set a timeout for 2 seconds. We'll add a console log to show when we actually get into that resolution. Console out the name there, and then we'll resolve with the name. Okay, so check this out. So we'll set up a const here. We'll call that reduce promise. Now we'll take the characters array and call reduce on it. Now we'll leave that reducer function empty for the moment, but check this out. For the initial value, we're going to pass promise resolve. What? All right. stick with me. So the first argument to the reducer function, if you recall, is the accumulator. And the first time around, that's just the initial value. So we'll just call this pre-promise. And we know that we're iterating over the characters array, so for each iteration we receive a character. And let's return pre-promise.then do network request character's first name. Okay, now, oops, reduced promise. We'll do a then off that, and we will log out the final result. Excellent. So let's save that. Now we see resolving with SpongeBob, Tommy, Angelica, Reggie, Mickey, and finally resolving with Minnie, and final result Minnie. So you could tell that was almost painstakingly long. It took about 2 seconds between each one, but clearly each of these are chained off of each other. Now, I don't necessarily expect you to fully grasp that example, but I hope that it's something you can put in your back pocket and possibly use at a later time. I know I've used this strategy probably twice, so it's a little rare, but it was a really cool thing to pull out of my back pocket when I needed it. Okay, so last but not least, on the reduce method, if you were interested in seeing that written as a loop, here we go. Let's comment this out. And we will first write the reducer function, and we'll go back to the characters by name example, but we'll fix the variable this time. Okay, so remember, this is our reducer function, which is passed to reduce, and it will accept the accumulator, the current iteration's value, the current iteration's index, and the array that we're iterating over. So actually, because I'm lazy, but I'm just going to copy paste that here, make that easier on myself. We'll comment that back up. Cool. Make sure to change those. All right. Now we'll add a let down here. And this is actually going to be our initial value. And then we'll bring in the for loop. Okay, here's where it gets crazy. So for each iteration, we want to call this reducer function, pass in the current value, that's the accumulator, pass in the current item, that's the current character here, pass in the current index, and the array on which we're operating. So let's see what we get when we console that out. And as we saw in a previous example, for each last name, we get the characters associated with that last name as an array. Now, I don't know about you, but if I didn't already know what the array reduce method did, I wouldn't know what the heck this imperative code was doing at first glance. It's certainly not impossible to understand, but at least for me, it takes significantly longer to grok this code here than it does the regular reduce that we had up here. This, to me, is a lot cleaner. I hope it becomes that way for you as well, but if you do have any questions about this, be sure to leave some comments down below. I'd love to hear them.